Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Zach on Sports. I'm your host, Zach Gershman. With me today is the Hall of Fame broadcaster, MLB Network's own Bob Costas. Bob, welcome to Zach on Sports.
Zach, how you doing, man? You're tearing it up. You've got a cavalcade of stars joining you. You may be going down a notch or two with me, but you're doing great.
No, I mean, I even got up. I stepped up. I got a flag for this one. So we're doing good. We're going up in the world.
You're doing better than me because you've got your own logo and your own banner, and I'm just in my kitchen. And America is becoming very familiar with my kitchen. I feel like I should whip up an omelet or something just to
listen. You're a friendly guy. You're a friendly guy. It's a housewarming party, and let's get right into this interview. So, Bob, you have won many awards, so many awards along your career. But you have said that the Ford Frick Award that you won back in 2018, you've said it's your most valuable award. Why is that?
Well, baseball's always been my favorite sport. And when I have my A game going, I feel like it's the sport that I broadcast best, although I also am pretty proud of what we did with the NBA on NBC in the 90s. But baseball has always been the one. The Olympics are in a separate category as host of the Olympics. But in terms of play-by-play, baseball is the one that means the most to me. And to be somewhere on the list, not necessarily at the top, but somewhere on the roster with the Vin Scullys and Mel Allens and Red Barbers and people of that quality, Dick Enberg, that's a great thrill for me.
So you mentioned Vin Scully, Dick Enberg. Who are some of your mentors in the business?
Well, I think it's very important, Zach, and you'll learn this too. You can be influenced by people, but you should not copy them. Every great sports broadcaster doesn't sound that much like anybody else. There may be some similarities, but if you copy someone whom you truly admire, you'll just become a pale imitation of that person. So I think I've been influenced, wasn't a mentor, but I've been influenced by Vin Scully, his meticulous preparation, the idea that in baseball broadcasting, to the extent that you're able, you can tell anecdotes and be a bit of a storyteller in a way that the pace and rhythm of other sports doesn't allow. When I was a little older than you, not much, right out of Syracuse University, I went to KMOX in St. Louis, and Jack Buck was the reigning presence there. And I was influenced by Jack's ability to be irreverent, his dry wit, the parenthetical asides, the sense that you aren't just a broadcaster, but especially locally, you're part of the community, and that sports, baseball perhaps especially in St. Louis, stitches together people of varying backgrounds and ages who otherwise wouldn't have all that much in common. So you're in a position that's close to unique in your ability to put smiles on people's faces, to do things for charities, to pay it forward beyond the broadcasting world. And again, I'm not copying Jack, but I think I was influenced by that. I've tried to do that in my own life. Dick Enberg on the network level, I thought was a perfect blend of old school and new. He was very versatile, did a wide variety of sports exceptionally well. He captured the excitement. He was meticulous about detail, but he also was sentimental and warm-hearted. And so he leaned toward anecdotes and human interest type stuff. Jim McKay, again, I guess I succeeded him, in effect, as the longtime host of the Olympics. We're not the same person, but I think we had many of the same values. And he impressed upon me early on. He said, when I became the host of the Olympics, he said, Bob, remember, yes, the Olympics are a sports event, but they're also a travel log. They're also a series of stories about the background and the backstories of competitors from around the world. And many people who watch the Olympics are not avid sports fans. It's not the same thing as broadcasting a basketball game or a football game. You've got to broaden the scope out and not get too bogged down in the minutia that's of interest to the real hardcore fans. So I followed that advice. So I was influenced by Jim, but I didn't copy him.
Yeah, one of the things I've learned through these virtual interviews and having done Zach on Sports for the past couple of years is that one of the only things you could bring to the broadcast booth, or actually the only thing you could bring to the broadcast booth that nobody else can, is yourself. And that's what I believe all broadcasters, just like you said here, are trying to get that point across. And if we could go back a little bit to when we could go back into the broadcast booth and into the studios, although we're in your kitchen here, we're going to go back to when we were in the studios, and you've done countless amounts of interviews, had so many guests on your show. And I think one of the more challenging ones, I believe, was listening to your interview that you had with Jerry Sandusky. And not to get too much into the interview itself, I want to ask you more along the lines of the preparation. How do you prepare yourself for an interview with the topic that is such a sensitive topic, and with a guest that is being vilified?
Well, first of all, I read the grand jury presentment, which was what we had to go on at that point. And I spoke with people who work with children who had been the victims of predators to get a sense of some of the dynamics involved there. I had to be careful not to judge Sandusky on the air, not to indict him, but at the same time, I had to know some of the things that I might anticipate hearing from him. But at that point, in fairness, I was not preparing to interview Sandusky. I was preparing to interview his attorney, Joseph Amendola. And Amendola came up from Philadelphia for the interview. We were at 30 Rock, the NBC headquarters. And only a short time before we were to sit down and tape an interview with Amendola, he said to me out of the blue, "How would you feel if I could get Jerry on the phone with you?" And I remember thinking, I'm not sure this is the best course of action for you, but it would be a good thing journalistically and a good thing for the audience. This was one of those rare situations. Yes, it's a sensational story. It's troubling, but it was also legitimately journalistic, which is why I knew I had to do it. I'm not someone, I'm not at all comfortable with tabloid type things, and I've turned my back on them emphatically throughout my career. But this was a legitimate journalistic story that obviously did have an element of sensationalism to it. So when we wound up getting on the phone with Sandusky, all I did was repurpose the preparation that I had for interviewing Amendola. I just repurposed it to interviewing Sandusky. And what was actually the most difficult part of that for me was that he was on the phone, and all that NBC had in its files was 4 or 5 still pictures of him. They didn't have the usual B-roll that you could put in. And obviously he wasn't sitting across from me. Normally in an interview like that, you'd have 3 cameras. One would be on me, one would be on him, and another would be over here to take a 2-shot. Here, the entire time, with the exception of 5 seconds here, 5 seconds there, where they might have gone to a still shot of him from the archives, the entire time I'm on camera. And you can test this out for yourself, Zach. Nobody maintains eye contact with another person continually for 15 minutes or more. You could be sitting across the table from someone you plan to propose marriage to, but you still look down, you look away. If you're just locking eyes with someone, it's almost spooky. Mm-hmm. But I could not look away from the camera because that was the only shot they had. So the entire time that he's saying these very troubling things, and America is drawing its own conclusions about him in real time, if they hadn't already, not only do I have to maintain constant eye contact, which is a little unusual, but also my facial expressions could not betray my emotional reaction. If I sneered at it, if I raised an eyebrow, if I gave away some form of judgment, that would not have been the best thing for somebody in my position to do. So actually the hardest thing for me, since I was well prepared, was not the questioning itself. I had to listen intently because I wasn't sure that question 3 should follow question 2. I had to respond to what he was saying. So I was intensely alert and paying attention. But the most difficult part was just the eye contact and the blank expression.
Yeah, I can't imagine being in that position only a couple minutes before the actual scheduled interview. Everything kind of changes course. It was a little more than a couple. It was a little more than a couple of minutes, but it was less than an hour. Wow. So still, even that, preparing for interviews, you kind of have your suit picked out, you have everything picked out, ready to go here, and then it's a crazy transition, and we're going to transition from that over to the NBA. You mentioned a little bit in the beginning here about how proud you were covering the NBA during the 90s, the Jordan era, of course. The Last Dance was released by ESPN, a 10-part docuseries just a few weeks ago. You and your broadcast calls were featured a lot during the docuseries. How do you feel knowing that? Well, you were also broadcasting. I should have mentioned this. You were broadcasting MJ's walk-off shot in Game 6. How do you feel knowing that your call, and how special is it knowing that you and your call will forever be attached to what you and some have said to be the greatest closing act in American sports history?
Lucky happenstance, right place, right time. But in that moment, I was aware that this was much more than just a clutch shot in a dramatic moment to conclude an NBA final. That would be a big sports story and a big sports moment under any circumstances. But I was aware that Michael Jordan's closing act, and we know that he came back a few years later with the Wizards, and that's really a footnote. In terms of drama and theater, that was the end. And I knew that that story would be a big deal on the front pages of newspapers, not just on the sports pages, that it would be in Time and Newsweek, and it would lead newscasts, not just sportscasts. So Doug Collins, who in my mind is the best NBA analyst ever, he had broken down the particulars of that last minute, where it wasn't just that shot. Michael made 2 free throws. After a timeout, he made a driving layup. He stole the ball from Malone, and then he made the basket. I mean, the whole sequence is ridiculously clutch. But he had broken that down. Isaiah Thomas had made his comments. And then, luckily, I had the presence of mind to put it in a larger context. I had to be careful because I didn't know for sure that Jordan wouldn't come back the next year, but we were all pretty certain that he wouldn't. And I said something like, who knows what will unfold in the next few months, but that may have been the final shot that Michael Jordan will ever take in the NBA. And then luckily for me, just as I said that, they went to a slow motion replay, a different angle of the shot, which emphasized the beauty of his form and the perfect swish, just as I was saying. And if that's the last image of Michael Jordan, how magnificent is it? So those visuals and those words matched perfectly. And they do hold up 22 years later, so I'm happy with that.
What were your thoughts of The Last Dance docuseries?
I loved it. I thought it was very skillfully done. On its own terms, I'd give it a 10 on a 10 scale. There were some quibbles. Jordan had a certain amount of control. If you don't give him that control, the whole thing doesn't get made. You know, this wasn't a Ken Burns documentary. I know Ken very well personally. No one admires his work more than I do. He operates under different conditions. On its own terms, this was very entertaining. It was very revealing. There's certainly elements of history and journalism to it. Does it touch upon everything, every perspective, every possible thing that could be noted? No. But if you let those who had a criticism of it take a crack at it, they would have also come up short in some respects, and I sincerely doubt that they would have produced anything remotely as good as this was.
Who would you have on your Mount Rushmore of sports broadcasters?
Well, we know that Mount Rushmore has only 4 figures, and I think it's very, very difficult to limit yourself to 4. I think you also have to make a distinction between local broadcasters, or those who primarily have made their mark locally or on radio, and those who are best known as network broadcasters. So if it's network sports broadcasters, I think Jim McKay has to be there. I think Dick Enberg should be there. Al Michaels should be there. Now, Vin Scully, there's nobody better at what they did than Vin Scully was in sports broadcasting. And Vin, of course, excelled on network television. He never didn't excel at anything he was doing. But he is not as much identified with network television as the others I've mentioned. So I guess, and even there, I don't know, John Madden was tremendously impactful and tremendously important, but he's not a play-by-play announcer or host like McKay was, and the others are play-by-play announcers. Do you put Howard Cosell in a different category? He certainly was unlike anyone else, but like Madden in his own way, he was tremendously impactful. So maybe that fourth head is one profile is Cosell, the other profile is Madden, And come to think of it, that would be one very grotesque human being.
Yeah,
I don't
wow.
mean on a personal level. You got Madden's head on one side, Cosell's head on another. That's not exactly an oil painting.
No, we'll just say we're expanding the Mount Rushmore. Bob Costas' Mount Rushmore is expanding a little bit. But, Bob, we have a segment here on Zach on Sports called Beyond the Mic, where we get to know you as a person. Are you ready for it?
I am, I guess.
So, I guess you have no choice. But while sports has been a huge part of your life, you do have some credibility in the music and hip-hop industry. You were name-checked in Ludacris's song Hip Hop Quotables. Do you remember the lyric for it?
Yeah, I'd be rolling torpedoes, get blunted with Rostas. For a hefty fee, I'm on your record, like Bob Costas.
There we go.
By the way, that's my favorite. But I must tell you, Zach, far from the only time that the hip world has name-checked me. I think there's a half dozen or more because, as you know, my street cred is through the roof. Yes.
So other than waking up to that song every single morning, getting your day ready through that song, what would your walk-up song be?
That's my ringtone.
Is it?
No.
I was about to say, does anybody have ringtones nowadays? I haven't heard one. But what would your walk-up song be?
Wow. If I was coming out of the on-deck circle,
yes,
what would my walk-up song be? You've stumped me here, Zach. Probably after we're done, something will pop into my head. If I was Ricky Henderson, it could be Born to Run, right? That would make sense. I don't know. I got to think about this. Get back to me.
Well, we have a couple more minutes left in this interview. Right. Let's go over to the second question. You've done a lot of memorable interviews, have captured a lot of memorable stories, but one that you've spoken about recently was how O.J. Simpson tried reaching you from the back of the Bronco. Yeah. How have these stories and interviews, and if you want to talk about that story especially, I think the audience would love to hear that, but how have these stories and interviews impacted you as a person?
Well, it becomes part of the fabric of your life. There are all different shadings to a career and to a life. I've been lucky enough to intersect with some interesting and in many cases notable people. They've all impacted me in one way or another. In some sense, it broadens your view and understanding of the world. I've traveled much of the world because of the Olympics, primarily. So I guess that all goes into the mosaic, without being too poetic about it, the mosaic of who you are and who you're in the process of becoming.
All right, we're going to go right into the rapid fire. Bob, three quick questions here. You've done a lot of stuff. Which do you prefer, being a talk show host, an interviewer, or a play-by-play announcer?
Play-by-play of baseball, long-form interviewing, and something that has some element of commentary and journalism to it. Those would be the three things that are most important to me.
You hosted the Olympics for a bunch of years, bunch of different locations around the world. Which was the hardest name to pronounce during the Olympics?
The hardest name to pronounce. There was a Russian swimmer in 1996 in Atlanta, and I kept actually mispronouncing his name. I'd have some syllable, some emphasis incorrect somewhere in there. And I remember we had a great researcher named Dave Gobble, G-A-B-E-L, not like a turkey, although it was pronounced that way. And he was so exasperated with me because, and I'd say it one way, and then we'd go to commercial or go off to the event, and he'd come back from the back deck and spell it out phonetically for me again. And I'd somehow still get it wrong. But my salvation was, at least in my own mind, most people in Peoria didn't know the difference. Yeah. So I didn't get skewered for that. But of course, it was before social media. If it had happened, 20 years later, it might have been a different story.
Let's say you're a sports memorabilia collector here. For the final rapid fire question, let's say you're a sports memorabilia collector. What card do you want to surround your collection around? Would it be a Michael Jordan rookie card or your famous Mickey Mantle card you have?
Well, my Mickey Mantle card is a 1958 card. So he's in the middle of the prime of his career. I'm sure it still has, in mint condition, it still has considerable value. But the one that's super valuable, among the most valuable cards ever, is his rookie card. And in effect, that's 1952, because even though his rookie year was 1951, there was no Mantle card in 51. So the 1952 Mantle, which is, by the way, the only Mickey Mantle card that I do not have. I have every other one, but that one was worth much more than all the others combined. So I came up short on that one. So I guess that would be, given my fondness for Mantle and my personal connection to him, I think that would be at the center of it for me.
So it would be the 52 card, you'd say?
Yeah, 52 Mantle.
Now let's compare the 52 card to Bob Costas bobblehead. Which one are you choosing?
Well, you know, if I were in New York, and I'm in California now, if I were in New York, I could actually produce the Bob Costas bobblehead, which is not really a perfect likeness. It looks like some combination of game show hosts that were famous in the 60s or something. But, you know, I think on the open market at auction, I think even a battered Mickey Mantle card, the least valuable Mickey Mantle card, spindled and folded and in much less than mint condition, would be worth much more than my bobblehead.
I would love to have one. I'm trying to build my own sports memorabilia collection. So whether it's the folded Mickey card or a Bob Costas bobblehead, would love to have it. Bob, we're about to wrap up. I really want to go back to that question about the walk-up song.
You know, I should have thought about this. Man, what would be my walk-up song? Well, there was a song back in the 60s that my detractors might say should be my walk-up song. You talk too much. You worry me to death. You talk too much. You make me fret. You just talk too much. I forget who sang it. It was a hit in the 60s. It was also a hit in the 60s by Marcy Blaine called Bobby's Girl. I want to be Bobby's girl. That's the most important thing to me. But that would be kind of a weak walk-up song. I got to work on this. I mean, Glory Days is so obvious by Springsteen. Anybody could have Glory Days because they all could theoretically do something glorious. I'm coming up empty. I got a lame answer here. I've failed you here, Zach.
It's all right. It's all right. I won't take it personally. I'll just hope that the pitcher has fear in his eyes when you come up to bat. But Bob, thank you so much for joining Zach on Sports. I had a fantastic time, and I really hope you did as well. This was an incredible interview.
Thank you, Zach. When I was your age, I was not as far along as you are. So you are way ahead of the game. Congratulations.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. For everybody else, I'll see you guys next time on Zach on Sports.